Thanks so much for being here. I know you've already been welcomed to Abu Dhabi more than enough times, but I feel it's also my right to do so because even though it probably doesn't sound like it, I spent my childhood 1 mile from where we are right now on Sheikh Hamdan Street until I was 7 years old. So this is very much home to me. I'm delighted to see what has become of this incredible city and country from the time I was here and the decades since. Rachel said something very interesting this morning. I wanted to jump up and cheer. She said, we call this area the Middle East, but this is really West Asia. And the geographer in me has been screaming that one line for the last 25 years, that indeed we are geographically in West Asia. So that's why I gave the title for this presentation, the Arab-Asian Nexus. And in a way, it should not be as remote a sort of notion as it seems because we very much share this region. So let me begin by pointing out the following, that the Asian growth story that by now is so central in our minds, China is neither the beginning nor the end of that story. It is the midpoint. And this is extremely important because for a lot of people in the Western markets and analytical community view Asia as synonymous with China. As goes China, so goes the region. That would be a mistake. Let me begin by pointing out that the Asian economic miracle began with Japan. Right? From 1945 to 1975, it took only 30 years for Japan to become the world's second largest economy. The Japanese story, modernization, industrialization, really inspired the tiger economies, right? South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. The latter two obviously having those colonial advantages. By this point in time, the late 1970s, China, as you know, is still reeling, actually, from the effects of the Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward. Then Deng Xiaoping assumes leadership, and he begins exactly 40 years ago, actually, with the establishment of Shenzhen as China's first special economic zone to open up to foreign investment. The rest is history. China becomes the world's factory floor and so forth. Now, that's what I would characterize as the first 3 waves of modern Asian growth. Japan first, then the tigers, then China. Now remember that today we're almost conditioned to view bilateral economic ties in a zero-sum confrontational way because of the trade war. But the story of the first 70-plus years of Asia's modern growth is the story not of zero-sum competition, but of mutually reinforcing waves. As I said, it was Japan that inspired the tigers, and the Japan and the tigers that inspired China. And who have been the most steady, consistent, loyal investors in China? Who helped make China what it is today, if not for Japan and the tigers, right? And so now, for many people, again, falsely, this is the end of the Asian story. It's all about China, China, China. But we are already, I would say, quite advanced into the 4th wave of Asian growth, and that encompasses the South and Southeast Asian countries. Now note the population figure, 2.5 billion people from Pakistan through India through ASEAN. That is 1 billion more people than China. Every single country in orange has a younger median age than China, except for Thailand, which is roughly similar. If this collection of countries, right, it's obviously not one country, but low to middle income and lower middle income countries, if they grow at just 5%, let's give them a democracy deficit or handicap, right? They're not going to grow at 10% for decades the way China did, but even if they grow at just 5%, this region has a combined GDP of equal to China's present GDP in less than 10 years. And less than 10 years is about private equity investment cycle, right? So you need to be planning yesterday already to capture this. And I'll go into a bit more detail in a bit, but these are of course the regions that are benefiting so much from the trade war, given their lower wages, and you have so much diversion of foreign investment that's accelerating this growth, which is a reminder of the fact that the pattern continues, because who are the largest investors in South and Southeast Asia? It's their preceding predecessor countries that are more modern and developed and wealthy. So, we often talk about anniversaries, right? I mentioned the 40th anniversary since China's opening. It's the 30th anniversary since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Asians, it's the 20th anniversary, more or less, since the Asian financial crisis. And what Asia has spent the last 2 decades doing is getting a lot of things right. when it comes to economic reform, structural reforms, moving back towards policies, flexible exchange rates, building up their trade surpluses and currency reserves and so forth. And some very important things have happened as they've regained the trust of markets. There's now a lot more local currency liquidity in Asia. That allows for Asian sovereigns and corporates to do a lot more long-term, have a longer investment horizon, make the necessary investments in infrastructure that have been lacking in those countries for a long time. And that's also enabled, with their greater production and consumption, a shift towards more purchasing power parity measurements of growth. So the combination of the local currency, debt, the unfolding capital account liberalization, where China is the big story in that regard this year, but what Japan has already done and Korea has already done and now China is doing with the capital account, you can well imagine developing Asia is going to be looking at that and saying, we want to do that too. Obviously, right? A lot of countries that want to manage their balance of payments, they're not go into too high a deficit and raise foreign capital, draw in foreign investment. This copycat effect is going to continue to play out. And again, South and Southeast Asia will be central in that. If you take the Asian mega region as a whole that I've been referring to thus far, what you see is it's already in purchasing power parity terms about half of global GDP. According to HSBC, Standard Chartered, and others, they've announced that 2020 is the year that in PPP terms Asia is half of GDP. That would stand to reason. It's more than half the world population, as you know, and now it is also half of GDP. That doesn't mean that Asia is replacing the West, right? If you divide the world in PPP terms, you clearly see that we live in a tripolar economic world, with North America, Europe, and Asia being very important, critical pillars in all of that. Today already, there have been conversations about how important the new cross-Asian flows are in terms of what sovereign wealth funds, PE, and other asset managers are doing in terms of deepening the cross-border interactions in the Asian space. So let me go back and talk about just briefly how that is a continuation of what's been happening for the last 30 years. From the day the Soviet Union collapsed, basically, is when globalization finally had an opportunity to become global. We've had the word globalization since the 1950s, but it wasn't actually global until the 1990s, when gradually every country became part of the global economic system. And what Asians have been doing since the commodities super cycle of the 1990s, by which the Gulf states here on the left began exporting far more hydrocarbon energy across the Indian Ocean, to China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, to the incorporation of Central Asian countries as well into the Asian trading system, again, liberated from the Soviet Union. You had obviously China joining the World Trade Organization, India with its economic reforms, and now with the rise of Southeast Asia and its lower wages, those countries getting a lot more foreign investment as well. Every line that you see on this map represents today's volumes of bilateral trade between pairs of countries or subregions, and I've gone back 15 years, 10 years, 5 years to the present. Every one of these is growing because Asians have so much complementarity among their economies. You have the commodities producers, commodities importers, manufacturing centers, countries that import all of their finished goods, technology hubs, financial centers, and those that are deprived or starved of those things. So there's so much more headroom in terms of the complementarities that Asians stand to benefit from each other. Even though, I should point out, Asia today has 60% of its trade internal to Asia. Only Europe has a higher share of internal trade as a share of its global trade. And this is remarkable because this is just the story of the last 25 years, right? So Asia has managed to overcome 500 years of colonialism and Cold War division and rebuild those Silk Roads in exactly 25 years. And despite the fact that this is by far the most ethnically, linguistically diverse region of the world. Again, the complementarities. Here you see the top three trading partners in oil, gas, hydroelectric power, and coal of each major Asian country. And what you're seeing is this internalization of Asian energy trade as one vertical to look at. And this is going to accelerate. What we've seen is that, historically, or the last 20 years, Asians pay very high prices for natural gas. But now you have not only a lot more natural gas exploitation in the region, but you've got LNG markets now and futures and spot markets for LNG gas. That's bringing prices down. Just last week, the Power of Siberia pipeline opened, the first natural gas pipeline flowing directly from Russia into China, for example. So the number of energy projects that is unfolding is voluminous. Then comes food trade. I take that as another example. So food production and exports, top 3 trading partners of each country, producer and consumer. Again, a growing intensification. I probably don't need to tell anyone that as we turn on the TV every day and see what's happening with the world's largest food producing countries when it comes to the impact of climate change, droughts afflicting parts of the United States, Brazil, Australia, China, and India, right? The 5 largest food-producing countries in the world, all under a growing stress in their agricultural sectors. So a large amount of investment needs to go into optimizing the fertile territories of Asian countries that have not traditionally been significant food providers. And that's going to be critical for our agricultural resilience in the same way that it has been necessary in the energy markets. But with, of course, the fact that, again, you're dealing with 5 billion people. Many of these countries are poor, post-colonial countries that still have very rudimentary infrastructure. So Belt and Road that we think of as just a big kind of infrastructure project, it's a lot more than that. It's about the modernization of dozens of countries that have either been post-colonial or post-Soviet for decades and haven't had the opportunity yet to modernize. So here you see some of the major transportation linkages. I have a couple of more maps of this coming up, but here are some of the highway networks and some of the flight routes. And I've spotlighted only the most intense airline connections. And interestingly enough, 10 of the 10 busiest international flight pairs in the whole world are actually between Asian cities. So you're seeing a lot more flows of people, whether it is students, business travelers, tourists, and so forth. The rate of growth of intra-Asian travel is double the rate of Asia outbound travel. So in other words, if you live in the US or Europe and you say, my goodness, it used to be all these Japanese tourists and now it's lots of Chinese tourists, just remember it's twice as much in other Asian countries. Just the other day, I think CNN.com, I saw top 10 most visited countries or cities in the world, and the top 5, except for Paris, were Asian cities. So Asians have that disposable income. They're increasingly paying in their own currencies for their flight and transportation. And with the infrastructure improvements, they're able to move a lot more easily around each other's countries. Many parts of Asia, sub-regionally and even more broadly regionally, are becoming visa-free zones. In Southeast Asia, we have free labor mobility. Even the Central Asian countries that have been quite suspicious of each other for a long time have moved towards what they call a silk visa regime. So mobility of people and the growing mobility of capital are going hand in hand here, and the infrastructure investments are facilitating it. So again, I've tried to take this 30-year point of departure from the end of the Cold War. And similarly, if you look at maybe just the last 15 years as China has begun to really accelerate its outbound investments into infrastructure, it's been allocated quite sort of quite diffuse all over the world, but the regions that have been benefited the most in a way from outbound Chinese investments, which we now call Belt and Road, but again, the term has only existed for 4 or 5 years, but China has been doing these kinds of investments since the 1990s, like pipelines in Kazakhstan and so forth. I always laugh when people pretend as if Belt and Road began sort of 3 or 4 years ago, because otherwise I don't know what I wrote my first book about 15 years ago when I was traveling through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and writing about Chinese pipelines, right? So just because it has a name now, it doesn't mean it hasn't been happening for 30 years. It has. And I underscore that point because it also reminds you how irreversible this is. The fact that what these regions that really belong together in that Silk Road spirit are going to continue to reconnect no matter what opposition there may be internally or externally. So huge volumes of Chinese investment and infrastructure activity in the developing world. And here I wanted to emphasize why it is that you see such a enthusiastic, at least from the commercial side, if not the diplomatic side, participation in this resurrection of the Silk Roads. And it's simply by looking at this. Where are the largest EPC companies in the world? And the answer is that the vast majority of them are either European or Asian, with a fair number of them being Chinese. So they have a very, very keen vested interest in unlocking these bottlenecks and in ensuring more frictionless trade across the Eurasian domain. And it's hard for someone I've been in I worked in the Pentagon, the US military, I've been in Washington think tanks and policy making, and I've always struggled to explain to people in Washington why it is that Europeans pretty much hung up the phone on Barack Obama when he was president and he tried to convince European allies not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I said, well, just look at this. Look at what their major export-oriented industrials are, and look at ours, where just a couple of the largest construction engineering firms in the world are American. Most of them are Eurasian, and this is going to be their bread and butter. It already is, and it will be in the decades ahead, which helps to explain, and the underlying data behind this is so significant. I actually get asked all the time, if you had 5 minutes with Donald Trump, what would you say? And I said, well, I'm not sure that, lectures or books would have much of an impact, but I would show him just one map. If I could, of my thousands of maps that I have an arsenal of, if I could pick just one to show Donald Trump, it would be this. And it's really simple. I think everyone in this room knows this better than I do. The size of your economy does not necessarily correlate to your weight in global trade, right? Because the United States and North America in general are the most autarkic, self-sufficient continent in the world. So even with the largest GDP, it only represents 14% of global trade. So in other words, it has less leverage in dictating others' trade practices and relationships than the White House tends to think. Meanwhile, if you look at Europe, 38% of global trade, owing, of course, largely to its internal integration. Asia, 34%, catching up very quickly. If you think about all the trade liberalization that's going on in Asia, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, ASEAN +3, and so forth, all accelerating that. Most important number, perhaps, on this slide is the 1.6 trillion, right? So Europe today, and I think probably all of us are old enough or young enough to have grown up in a transatlantic world where the US-EU transatlantic economic relationship and strategic partnership is really the bedrock of global order. And but that number, 1.1 trillion, is transatlantic trade today, and we know that it's more or less stalled out. Whereas with Europe and Asia, again, across the Eurasian continent, it's already at 1.6 trillion a year. Again, reinforcing why, for Europeans, not only having reciprocal market access into China and collaborating with China through joint projects in infrastructure and other areas is so critical, but also why Europe has moved towards, now as an FTA with Japan, wants to have something similar with ASEAN based on the trade deal it already has with Singapore, and eventually to bring India into that as well. Meanwhile, obviously, the U.S. trade relationship, even with close geopolitical allies like Korea, is strained. So you can imagine that 1.6 trillion, 10, 15 years from now, is going to rise to well over $2 trillion, while these other axes of trade are potentially even going to shrink or plateau. So, why is it so important to think about Asia and Eurasia, and as we sit here in Abu Dhabi, as the future center of gravity of the world economy? Because A, it already is, and B, the trade volumes are growing so significantly. One could even say or speak of a Euro-Asian kind of decoupling. To me, it really isn't just a US-China decoupling that's going on, because as you know, the US-China trade volume has shrunk to such a low amount numerically that it's less than China's trade with ASEAN. So just to be clear, China trades more with the Southeast Asian countries, many of which you may never even been to potentially, than it does with the United States. So this is not about just the numbers, it's the overall trajectory. Meanwhile, the intra-Asian trade is larger than its external trade, and trade with Europe is far larger than the United States. So this is a train that's left the station. Probably an appropriate metaphor, given that I want to talk a bit more about Belt and Road right now. Now, I think as I indicated earlier, I've spent about 20 plus years just traveling on the countries in this map, especially the stands. They're my favorite. My nickname in college was Paragistan, because I just couldn't help but grab my backpack and go and hang out in these places. And I continue to, and what I see is that there is a lot of tension or concern over the dominance of China in these economies, either as the largest trading partner or source of foreign investment. But there's also a sense of necessity about that need to modernize and to do so at the most affordable price. Now, we hear a lot about debt trap diplomacy. The truth is that it's really the smallest countries, most vulnerable, those that are already highly indebted countries, to some degree to China already or to Western creditors, who are taking on more debt, but in the service, ideally, of these infrastructural platforms for growth. I think the evidence is clear from about 250 years of history since the Industrial Revolution that if you want to grow, you have to continue to modernize your infrastructure and have that be a platform for growth, for job creation, for economic diversification, and that's what these countries are doing. So squeezing that multiplier effect out of these new infrastructure investments, and that's what most countries are actually doing quite well. We know for a fact that whether it's China or Japan or whether it is new investment plans or loans that come from the Asian Development Bank or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, it's a very important signal. It has a market-making kind of function, and you see that foreign investment increases rapidly on the back of that in many of these countries. The point I want to get into now is that it's not just about China. Japan was one of the leaders in cross-border development financing and infrastructure investment well before Belt and Road was created. And what has happened since Belt and Road was announced is that it's kicked off what I call here the infrastructure arms race. And that's something I want everyone to remember very well, this term, because we have this, there's a mythology almost that geopolitics is sort of linear, and there are these inevitabilities around one superpower being replaced by another superpower, and the whole world can be reduced to a power transition from United States to China. That's not the way history works at all, actually. Maybe it's the way things worked in the middle of the 20th century, but that's very much an anomaly within Western civilization. Globally, the pattern is actually very clear, is that as empires expand and they give gifts, and that's what Xi Jinping calls Belt and Road, a gift to the world, is that over time they use those gifts to achieve the kinds of economic growth that I've been describing, and eventually to grow out of that dependency on their patron. And that's exactly what's happening right now with China. And you're seeing that many countries have decided that they've been warned in a way by the episode with Sri Lanka and Hambantota port, where China decided, or Sri Lanka felt it had to lease this port to China for 99 years. Just imagine, that was the point in time 2 years ago where most analysts started saying, well, this is the beginning of the return of the Ming dynasty, and China is going to have its treasure fleets all across the Indian Ocean, and imperial patterns are repeating themselves. That's not what happened at all, because the very next day, pretty much every cabinet of every country you see on this map, whether it is Kenya or Djibouti or Pakistan or Malaysia, convened and said, how do we avoid becoming the next Sri Lanka? Right? And that's why, as you've been following the news in the last couple of years, you see countries saying, hold on, we're going to renegotiate that debt. Right? We have to write down that. We're going to cancel these projects with China. It's as a reaction to the fact that they view China as being a bit too influential in their countries. Then comes the awakening by the great powers. Because a couple of, 3 or 4 years ago, you didn't have the US International Finance and Development Corporation, you didn't have the Europe, Japan Sustainable Infrastructure Finance Initiative, you didn't have the US Australia Blue Dot Network to certify infrastructure projects, you didn't have the EU Asia Connectivity Initiative, you didn't have Japan and India talking about connectivity corridors. Every single one of those great power initiatives is an attempt to compete with China's Belt and Road and to dilute their influence in the infrastructure finance market. And it's working. And therefore, again, you cannot look at geopolitics in this linear way where whatever China wants, China gets. Instead, what you're having is this effect where you have a competition, and competition is good in the sense of an infrastructure arms race, because it's actually a race to provide the most competitive lending terms to these countries that really do want to invest and grow. And the net effect is to actually assure a multipolarity in Asia and Eurasia rather than Chinese dominance. And that's actually a good outcome. It's a good outcome for China as much as it is a good outcome for these countries on the receiving end. Again, as someone who studies Belt and Road very closely, I'm not going to summarize every single example, but you can have people generalize or pretend that Belt and Road is a hegemonic plot and a one-way street, but in fact it's not. I cannot find any sort of uniform pattern where countries react to, respond to, or are shaped in the same way by Belt and Road. Every country is reacting rather differently and finding ways to attempt to shape it to its own benefit rather than merely in the service of China. Again, that's a good thing for them and ultimately for China as well. There are countries like Russia that are quite compliant with Chinese interests, and there are other countries that are pushing back, canceling projects, welcoming in competition for investment and lending and so forth. And you can see that happening whether it's Ethiopia or Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Uzbekistan, and the other pivotal countries in Belt and Road. Again, this competition, this infrastructure arms race also helps to make these projects bankable, right? This has been the key criticism, and it's a very valid one, about project selection with Belt and Road. So how do you make them more bankable? Again, it's through this, bringing about a more distributed marketplace of opportunities. I'm pleased to see that Western financial institutions are getting much more involved in this. Sometimes in partnership, as co-investors, working together with Chinese state banks, but also on their own, working with equity partners and with local utilities and companies to start to get some of these projects jump-started, independent of whether or not China is involved in them. And you're seeing that happening around. This is, as I mentioned earlier already, the sort of reaction to Belt and Road is creating this very significant marketplace. Now let me focus just very briefly in the remaining couple of minutes on Southeast Asia, which is the region not only, again, that has really entered the spotlight as a result of the trade war, but I think to be historically accurate, it would be wrong to say that the trade war is the reason why ASEAN is now receiving so much more FDI into manufacturing. I mean, there is a joke that we tell in Singapore: the U.S.-China trade war is over and Vietnam is won. And you can see that with the supply chain shifts into Vietnam and other countries. But again, to be accurate, Japan began diverting large volumes of FDI out of China into Southeast Asia 10 years ago. They began to do it when China had temporarily banned the export of rare earth minerals to Japan, and Japan realized, you know what, we have too many eggs in the China basket. We need to diversify. And that's now what American investors, European investors, and China itself has begun to do with the offshoring into ASEAN. So ASEAN is a real winner. It's the 10-year story of that fourth wave of growth, not just the post-trade war, sort of right place at the right time kind of story, because again of those structural reforms that I mentioned earlier that they've been undertaking since the financial crisis. There's 10 countries in ASEAN, but I'll spotlight just a couple where I see a lot of potential, not least because of infrastructure investment, structural reforms, privatization, and I think it's absolutely critical for investors around the world who are looking to get into these markets because they want to maintain their macro sort of fundamentals. There is a real privatization wave that is going to unfold really all the way between here and the Philippines in the next 10 years. A lot of these countries have been holding back because they don't have the right plans, because they haven't yet been credible enough, and because they've had elections. In the last 1 year, we've had elections in India and Indonesia and the Philippines, and democracy and privatization don't always go hand in hand because, of course, they're losers from privatization domestically when you start to cut subsidies and open up to foreign competition. But now that those elections are over, and now that a country like India is struggling with the banking sector reform and attracting investment, privatization is going to be a very important story. I'm out of time, and I have to, so just final couple of points. There's a lot of high-growth local companies in Southeast Asia, and it's not a story about China coming in and buying up the market. It's actually the story of capitalizing very significant new national champions in the technological arena, country by country. The development of super apps in many of these countries, like WeChat, that model is now spreading to Indonesia and other very large countries. And so I really think it's a very smart move to look closely at how you can be a part of the co-financing of these startups. The ecosystems of Asia and the tech sector are incredibly promising, and I spend quite a bit of time with some of these companies, and I find them to be very high potential. So I'm out of time, so I'm gonna have to, I guess it would be appropriate just to end on the note about, unless I'm not even allowed to move slides forward because I'm out of time. Wow, that's really cutting me off, but I deserve it. At least I got to show this. The prime beneficiary from the diversion of or the reduction of Chinese FDI into the United States over the last 2 years, right? That capital has gone somewhere. That $100 billion that China is not investing in the US is going primarily now into other Asian countries, and West Asia, MENA, this region, is a huge beneficiary of it. You can see how they're climbing the ranks in terms of flows. So as mentioned already today, the UAE has China as its largest trading partner, but it's also increasing its trade with Southeast Asia, the food trade I mentioned earlier, with India as well. And that's going to influence that. I guess I will close on this point. I'm glad that it was mentioned briefly this morning that the geography of the UAE, the geography of Abu Dhabi is right over there on the right side of this map, but it's right here in the middle of this one, right? Here we are. And when historians talk about the ancient Silk Roads and the pre-colonial world, there's this term they use, Afro-Eurasia. And it's not a word that I'd come across until just 2 years ago, but I love it because it captures Africa, Europe, and Asia. And the 16th century world was Afro-Eurasia, right? The Western Hemisphere was not yet really part of, certainly not a dominant part of the world economy. What's happening today is the resurrection, right, of this Afro-Eurasian system. So there couldn't be a better time to be based here in the UAE and looking multi-directionally at how to be a connector, how to be a bridge between these three very important demographic and economic regions. So with that, thank you very much.